In today's episode, I've got Daniel Markovitz from Yale Law School and author of the book, The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite. But first...
There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the gang gang. Drew, gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew, gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew, gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the gang gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Professor Markovitz, welcome to the show, sir.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I have to tell everyone that I think I may have first heard of your book when I was interviewing this guy, Jonathan Herzog, who ran for Congress in New York and was an early Yang 2020 campaign volunteer and staffer. And he had mentioned the book because I was lamenting to him how, wow, Jonathan, you could be doing a lot of things. Like, he graduated first in his class from Harvard, and he had a law degree, and I think he also had an MBA. And I was like, and here you are running for Congress. And he said, well, kind of achieving those high levels of distinction isn't necessarily winning if you read The Meritocracy Trap. And I was like, that's interesting. So I always had that on my mind. Finally had the time to crack it open a few weeks ago. And I have to say it was very illuminating, but also quite unsettling because I have been very lucky in this kind of I think you call it superordinate worker type career. And I've assumed, oh, well, now I got really lucky. I worked hard and things came my way, and now I can provide for my kids. But I think your argument is like, well, it's not necessarily the most sustainable path. So we definitely want to get into that. But before we jump into the thesis of the book, let's just get a little bit of a background on who Daniel Markovitz is and what's your life journey been like so far.
All right. Well, so in connection with the book, I am, deeply embedded in the system the book describes, and in a way, part of the problem. I'm an agent of reproducing the system.
Yeah.
In terms of my own background, I did not have a hard scrabble or difficult childhood. My parents were professionals. But I did spend time. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, and I just went to whatever the local public school was always. And so I spent my childhood in public schools, not in suburban schools, mostly in urban schools. Went to high school in Austin, Texas, in the Austin school district, not in the suburban school districts. And then, went off to college. And that's when I sort of entered into the Ivy League and have spent most of my adulthood in one or another fancy university. So that's my basic story.
And what led you to, because you teach law at Yale, and I guess I would not have assumed that a law professor would be so interested in this topic. This almost felt more like an economics or sociology type, book. I was curious how you got there.
Well, I have a master's degree in economics and a PhD in philosophy, in addition to a law degree. So I'm trained in the sort of humanities and social sciences. And I've been interested in economic inequality and structural inequality basically ever since childhood, partly because I had this relatively comfortable childhood, but my mother is an old socialist, studies socialist legal thought. And so I grew up with Marx and Engels in the house. and was interested in sort of thinking about and analyzing the forms of privilege and exclusion that at that point in my life I was mostly benefiting from. And there was also a perfectly direct part of it, which is that because of my schooling, a lot of my friends were not as privileged as I was. And so it was pretty clear to me, even as a kid, that there were forms of structural advantage and disadvantage that were sort of pushing me forward. And it looked like I was doing really well and achieving things, but whatever I was achieving was on the back of all sorts of advantages that I had nothing to do with.
Yeah, the thing I was told growing up by my admittedly pretty conservative mother was that, hey, if you get all A's and you work hard and you go to these elite institutions, you'll do really well, and you will have earned it and you will have deserved it. And that if you see a lot of folks who are struggling, like they just didn't want to work as hard as you. And I think over the years, I've observed how you can get into one school or one program or another, partly, of course, on merit, but then there's chance. There's just like a numbers game where there are so many qualified people and the outcomes are widely divergent, even though the core capabilities and work ethic are comparable. When did that kind of occur to you, or were you kind of aware of that much earlier?
Well, that occurred to me early on, partly because if I just think about my friends from when I was a boy, I had one friend, for example, whose parents were not professionals, middle-class kid, and he applied to 2 colleges, Princeton and Texas A&I. And he was waitlisted at Princeton and ended up going to Texas A&I. And it now leads a perfectly successful middle-class life in Texas, but he was almost admitted to Princeton. And I have no doubt that if he had applied to, the rational maximizing outcome array of colleges,
right.
He would have ended up getting into Columbia, and he would now lead a quite different life. Now, I think it's an open question which would have been better for him. That's something we can talk about. But the point is, even when I was a kid, I saw that the thing that stopped this kid from getting into Columbia was not his hard work or his ability. It was just that he had a certain kind of worldview in which he was not well placed to maximize his opportunities.
Yeah, I have a guy who I worked with very closely for many years. Super, super smart guy. He kind of grew up in a more like a working lower middle class family. And he told me when he was in high school, he assumed that, if you want to go to college, you go to the state university. And he didn't know anything about sort of the wider array of university options available, because he assumed I don't have $50,000 a year to pay for that. And you wonder oh my God, meanwhile, there's these other families that are probably 20, 30 miles away from him, where those kids are getting prepped for their college applications when they're in preschool and doing internships in junior high.
Right.
And it's just such BS how we kind of convince ourselves that, if you make it to the highest levels, that's because you're just so good, when in reality, many, many people don't even know how the game is played.
Well, the thing about this system, which is, I think, in a way, the most insidious part of it, is that because the competition to get in, or in college, or for that matter, the competition to get a job at Goldman Sachs is real. It can both be true that the people who, as it were, win have really worked hard and accomplished something. And at the same time, it can be true that they benefited from massive, unfair, undeserved advantages. So, it's not like the old aristocracy, whereas the old aristocrat, the way that he got ahead, and it would have been him because these were mostly patrilineal titles, the way he got ahead was his dad died.
Yeah.
And there was no pretense that he deserved it in any meaningful way. It was just obvious, barefaced inequality. Whereas the system that we have now makes it the case that to get ahead, you actually have to try really hard and work really hard. And that makes it very natural for those who do get ahead to attribute their advantage to their effort, which from their own experience is a real thing.
Yeah.
And it also makes it natural, just one more thing, sorry, for society to blame those who don't get ahead. And so you get a kind of a dark psychology of it, that because there's this appearance of desert, it makes the inequality even worse.
Yeah, it's interesting how both of those perspectives can be very true. The people who are at Goldman now probably did work their ass off and probably are very smart. And also, there are tons of very smart people who work their ass off who are not at Goldman through no fault of their own. And they just, you know, they didn't have access to a lot of the advantages and opportunities. I remember in college, I was chatting with a friend who said, "Oh, well, you know, just assumed like, oh, you went to the CTY program when you were in junior high too, right?" And I was like, "What is the CTY program?"
Right.
Like, I didn't know. And there's all these degrees. And I'm sure there's other things that I have no idea about still that are great benefits for people to set them up for success.
Yeah. You want an example of that, which is, I think, particularly vivid. If you look at all the elite private schools and prep schools and boarding schools around the country, particularly on the coast, on the West Coast and the East Coast, almost all of those schools will have sports like women's crew. Almost none of them will have a cheerleading squad. Now, why is that? Well, here's one important reason why. Harvard and Princeton and Stanford field women's crew teams. And if you are a relatively athletic young woman and you work hard at crew from age 11 to age 18, you're going to have to work hard, but you're going to become pretty good. And so then you're going to be a credible rower for, Cornell. And again, it's not that you haven't tried. It's not that you're not a good rower. It's just that what your situation has done is it's trained you to get good at the thing that the next rung on the ladder wants you to be good at. Whereas if you went to my high school when I was a kid and you were that young woman athlete, you would have been in the drill team, or the cheerleading squad, and you would also have been a pretty good athlete. But, University of Pennsylvania or Wharton doesn't have a slot for a cheerleader. But it does have a slot for a rower.
Yeah. Now, you talked about, so that part of the book, it was confirmational in terms of at least the way I was observing advantage and privilege and sort of its impact on economic outcomes for people. The thing that I found most thought-provoking that I hadn't heard before was this idea that, if you are lucky enough to have kind of gotten yourself into a role at Goldman or McKinsey or wherever, or Cravath, you didn't necessarily win the lottery in life the way an aristocrat would, because an aristocrat, like, he literally would just collect rent.
Right.
And these kind of winners, their lives aren't fantastic all around.
Right. So let's do this comparison with the aristocrat and sort of take it seriously for a minute. The way in which the aristocrat was rich, he had a lot of wealth, and he held his wealth in land. And maybe a little bit later, he held his wealth in that he owned factories. Or maybe a little bit later, he had a trust fund of financial assets. And the thing is, if you own that kind of wealth, the way in which you get income is you mix your wealth with somebody else's labor. So, if you're an aristocrat, you have serfs who work the land. If you're a factory owner, you have industrial labor that works your factory, and you take a cut of what they make, and that's how you get income. But the meritocrat today, the modern day aristocrat, mostly holds wealth in the form of their own training, their own accumulated skill or human capital. And the problem is that the only way you can get income out of human capital is by mixing it with your own labor.
Mm-hmm.
So the technology doesn't really exist yet for me to mix my training with somebody else's labor. It's not quite true. If I'm a partner at a law firm, I hire associates and I take a cut.
Mm-hmm.
So associates are in that sense like serfs. But mostly I have to work my own human capital. And what that means is that my meritocratic wealth ties me to a certain set of tasks and long labor hours determined by the market. And so the only way I can get my income out of my wealth is by doing whatever job the market says is going to pay a lot. That's the guy that you talked about at the beginning of the show, who could have been at Goldman or at Blackstone. And in order to maximize his income, that's what he would have had to do, because that's the way he would have gotten income out of all that training he'd had. But he didn't want to do it. And the problem is, if you don't want to do it, you're faced with the choice of either doing it anyway, in which case you're yielding, in the very classic Marxist sense, alienated labor, or giving up the ability to get the income that you need to pass your privilege down to your kids. Now, middle and working class people in America don't need to weep for this elite. Like, if you're excluded from all advantage, the fact that advantage is a little bit cursed is not such a big deal. But that doesn't mean it's good for the people who have it.
Right. Yeah, there is a bit of a winner's curse there, right? Because I remember in undergrad, I thought I wanted to go into law. And then I talked to a bunch of alumni who were working in law firms. And, it turns out it wasn't like, I had seen in the movies where they were, in courtroom all day making these grand arguments. But they seemed kind of unhappy, very wealthy, but not joyful at all. And I wonder, to what extent do we need to worry about our elite being devoured? Like, how big of an issue is that? Or is it like, well, it's not as good as it used to be a winner, but you'd rather still be a winner?
Well, look, I think you'd rather still be a winner. One reason for that is that the precarity of not being a winner has gone way up. So as the middle class has been gutted, it used to be that the alternative to being in the elite was to have a stable, lifelong job that paid you a wage that enabled you to raise your family and left you better off than your parents were, and meant your kids would probably be better off than you are. And that's just not true anymore. So one of the reasons that you want to be in the elite now is that being not in the elite has gotten a lot tougher. But with respect to the elite itself, if you're in my position, I teach kids who are going to become members of this elite. So I care about it because I care about my students. That's not a political position. That's just a human position. You interact with people, you want them to do well. But the real reason to care about it is that it's an opportunity. And here's why it's an opportunity. This country has gone through an incredible concentration of privilege and power in an incredibly narrow elite. Economic advantage and power are more concentrated in the United States today than they were in Rome at the height of the empire. That's how unequal we've become. And it's incredibly hard to unwind that kind of high-end inequality, that kind of concentrated power, because the only way to unwind it is to get the elite to give it up.
Right.
And they naturally don't want to. But if you can persuade them that it's not actually serving them well, that there's a trade to be had in which they give up, a third of their wealth or income in exchange for getting their freedom back, and that's a good deal for them, it opens up political possibilities that wouldn't be available otherwise. And I should say, you're at Nerds for Yang. In some ways, one of the things that, it's not that this was the direct feature of Yang's campaign, but he was somebody who was in this elite, but who recognized that this was not a form of life that he wanted for himself and society. And that move is very important to politics right now.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about is, because the primary asset that these superordinate workers have is their own knowledge and training and their specialized skills, and the only way to squeeze more value out of it is often to spend more hours, because you don't often have an easy way to to kind of marry it with less skilled labor. How does that change in the long run? Doesn't it seem like that trend is only getting more and more exacerbated to the extent that you have these even more specialized skills held by fewer people? And like, where does that end? Because that's nobody wants that, but that's just the way you get the economy works, right?
Right. So I don't think it's inevitable. There are two parts of this. One part of it is the education side. The concentration of education in this society has gone way, way, way up. It up from, say, 1950 to 1980 or so. One thing that the United States was really, really good at was getting more and more people through college. So the share of the population that went to college went up and up and up. And since the mid-'80s, it's been roughly stagnant. We've not gotten really good at getting more and more of our citizens to have college degrees. But the share of GDP devoted to elite educational spending has kept going up. And so what we've done is we've spent a growing share of our GDP on educating a smaller and smaller portion of our population, as it were. We've concentrated education. So one thing we can do is redistribute educational spending so that the gap between what's invested in a really rich kid's education and in a middle-class kid's education goes down. And what you have then is you have a broader educated workforce. And that workforce will transform the labor market in ways that suppresses both wages and demands for extreme hours at the top, and rises the demand for labor in the middle of the distribution and increases wages. And then the other thing that can happen at the same time is, technological determinism is false. Technology doesn't have an inevitable logic of development. We can choose which technologies to develop. And what we've done over the past 30 or 40 years is we've developed technologies that specifically favor super elite skills and substitute for, eliminate mid-skilled jobs. And if we could instead develop technologies that favor mid-skilled jobs, we could then both, once again, reduce the demand for super elite workers and increase the demand for middle-class workers. Let me give you one concrete example, because this has been sort of abstract. Think about healthcare. Think about heart health. Mm-hmm. We now know how to transplant a human heart. We know how to put a robotic heart into a person. That process requires a small number of super elite workers, doctors, research scientists. We don't actually know what the optimal balance of diet and exercise for an ordinary person is to avoid getting a sick heart. If we studied that and learned that, and then developed techniques for influencing people's behavior so that they were more near to their optimal. So if we had armies of nutritionists, lifestyle coaches, physical therapists, exercise aides, those are all mid-skilled jobs. We could have an army of those people who would go out into the population, help us as a population stay healthy. We'd have less need for heart surgeons. And what you get in the result is better population health and lots of good middle-class jobs for the people who are doing the mid-skilled work of keeping us healthy, rather than a few super-skilled jobs for the people who do the super-skilled work of replacing our heart when it gets sick.
Now you've touched on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, no pun intended. And so let me first start by saying, what I'm about to share is my personal opinion, is not that of my employer. Nothing I do on this channel is reviewed by my employer, but I do work in technology and related to healthcare. One of the things that I would say about your example with the heart surgeon, Daniel, is that I agree with you that you could argue that the impact on society would be much greater to prevent people from requiring these kind of extraordinary interventions earlier in the healthcare and lifestyle process. And that would provide a lot of jobs to middle skilled people, nutritionists, trainers, all kinds of folks, general practitioners, primary care folks. The current economic system does not reward that type of activity.
Right.
And, if I said to someone, hey, you should pay all this money out of your pocket to prevent requiring a heart surgery 20 years from now, that person is going to say, I don't have that money.
Right.
And if you go to their insurer, the insurer may say, no, he's fine. He doesn't need anything more.
Right.
And if you go on the flip side, if I went to some, insert famous research hospital, and I said, hey, I've got the world's best heart surgeon with the next generation techniques, and this is going to attract all the sheikhs, all the Russian billionaires. Whenever they need heart surgery, they're going to come to you. That'll get approved very quickly.
Right. Totally. That's totally right. And look, I mean, this is very concrete and practical. So for example, this morning before coming on this show, I went for a run. Now, I actually have no idea how far and fast I should run for my long-term heart health. Like, I have a basic sense that probably getting some cardio exercise is good for me.
Right.
I have no ambition to be a fast runner. I just want to be healthy. So, should I run 3 miles? Should I run 8 miles? Should I run once a week? Should I run every day? What's the right way to do this? I have no idea. And if I could get an idea and I needed some help to get myself to do it, my health insurance, which is pretty fancy health insurance, provided through my employer, would not pay for that. But if I get the calculation wrong and in 10 years I need a heart transplant, I will get over $1 million of medical services paid for through my insurance for me. But I cannot get my insurance to tell me what I need to do to prevent that, right? So that's crazy. And one way in which we often think of it is it's crazy for our health. It's a bad way to deliver health care. But another really important part of it is it's crazy for our labor market. And it's crazy for our economy and social distribution. Because as you said, if we could find a way to get the insurance to pay for these preventative measures, what we would do is we would create a large number of good middle-class jobs in a sector that's, after all, close to 1/5 of our economy, that can't be outsourced, that are humanly rewarding jobs. They're not just stable and well paid, but they're also jobs that people would like to do, that are, they're not in the salt mines. They're jobs where you're talking to people, where you're helping people, where you're using skills, where you're using your mind. They're good jobs. And we don't have the regulatory system. So one trick is a set of regulations to create the incentives to restructure the delivery of healthcare in a way that both improves population health and has these incredibly valuable benefits for the labor market. And we could talk about this in law, we could talk about this in management, we could even talk about this in manufacturing. Sector after sector after sector, this kind of a transformation is in principle possible. Yeah.
You rarely hear this being talked about by either party at the moment, though.
Yes, right.
As you touched on another topic that I also am very passionate about, which is the prescription of university education as kind of the silver bullet for everyone. And it reminds me of two things. One is a lot of talk on the progressive side of the Democratic Party about forgiving college loans. And two is I spent a few years living in Switzerland, which is actually the picture behind me. And they have a very different approach where very few people in high school end up going to university. But guess what? They end up with very good lifestyle, high quality of life, high quality of living. And but they have to learn different types of skills. And if you are literally like a roofer or an electrician or a mason, whatever it is, it's highly regarded. Right. It's not like you don't put your Ammer sticker on the back of your car like we do, did on the East Coast. And I was curious what your thoughts are. You are teaching at, the elite of the elite law program in the country, but not everyone needs to do that, right?
Right. No. And so a couple thoughts about that. One is, and law is really a poster child for how not to do this. So we have two legal services in the Army. Manipulate your affairs and stop breaking the law. You can still get relief from whatever regulation the state wants to impose. It's too expensive. Are we drifting in and out?
Yeah,
Tom,
Daniel,
can you hear?
your audio broke up for me. Let's
So
see if we could.
I can hear you again.
Okay, you can hear me again. I
Yes.
can hear parts of what you're saying. I wonder if temporarily, if you want to go video off, we can just talk audio while hopefully the connection improves. You want to give that a shot?
Let's try that.
Yeah, you can click
now,
the stop cam.
Yeah. We'll go audio only now for a minute. Can you hear me better now?
Oh, now actually I hear you perfect. Let's go try and go back to video. I think now it fixed itself.
Are we back in business?
Yeah, we're back in business. So
okay.
I missed it. You cut off at, hey, I teach at law. I work in the law industry, which is a perfect example of how not to do it.
Right. So why is it a perfect example of how not to do it? It's because we have two crises about law. One is rich people have too many lawyers. If you're really rich, you can hire an army of lawyers to structure your affairs in such a way that the state basically can't regulate or tax you. You can create complicated financial instruments that evade taxation perfectly legally because you're so sophisticated and have so much legal talent on your side that it's impossible to get a hold of you. On the other hand, if you're anybody else, you can't actually hire a lawyer to meet your basic needs. Try, for example, getting a divorce in America if you're middle class and finding a good lawyer, because a good lawyer will cost $10,000, $20,000 for the divorce. And who has $20,000 on each side to spend on a divorce? Now, one of the reasons for that is that the way in which we train people, this goes to your Swiss example, is that the person who does a divorce and the person who structures the merger and acquisition of GE and some billion-dollar company, both of those people need 4 years of college and 3 years of law school. But that's crazy because they're doing completely different tasks. So one of the things that the Swiss system does, or the German system, is it has non-university-based training at a very high level suited to the particular tasks that people are going to need to do. And so you have really excellently trained people doing the things that they're trained to do. Whereas what we have is this hierarchy. The other thing that they have, as you mentioned, is workplace training. We used to have workplace training in this country. In the 50s and 60s, employers devoted large amounts of resources to training people, both blue collar and white collar workers. If you were a white collar worker at IBM and you had a 40-year career there, you would have 4 years of IBM provided workplace training. If you were a blue collar worker at GM, you would show up at the bottom of the union scale, and if you worked hard, you'd get training and you'd become a tool and die maker or something like that. And now there's no training anymore. So workplace training is also a really important part of this. And that happens outside of universities. And the critical thing about workplace training is that you get paid while you're getting trained, so that you don't have to be rich enough to be able to take 3 years out of your life or 4 years out of your life making no money in order to get the skills you need to make a lot of money later on. So those are very important parts of our system. And, U.S. community colleges play some of this role. And recent suggestions and efforts massively to, fund up community college education are a very good idea.
Well, how much of this do you think is a set of cultural or societal kind of expectations? I mean, I grew up in the suburbs in northern New Jersey outside New York City. And if you said to someone, oh, my son's going to community college, or my son's training to be a physical therapist, or some, I would argue like, admirable and honorable work, there just wasn't, I wouldn't say it's a stigma, but it was definitely like, oh, well, what happened? What did you do wrong as a parent kind of thing?
Yeah.
And I don't know how we get out of that, because it feels like, we know that people paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to get on the, USC crew team or wherever. And I think that even like Harvard had some issues now. It's kind of, I wonder, how do you get parents of kids to think about alternatives to to going to university, because
Right.
as you mentioned, that's often doesn't result in the best outcome for the kid.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things is two things have to happen at the same time, and they're dependent on each other. So it's very hard to coordinate them. One is this transformation of the education system we've been talking about, but the other is the labor market transformation that we've been talking about. So if it were the case that, for example, a physical therapist had job stability and pay pretty similar to a general practitioner doctor, then the social stigma or honor associated to the jobs would be not so different.
Right.
And this can happen in a high-tech society. So I know a young German woman who, when she graduated from high school, she wanted to be a doctor. So she applied to medical school. The only medical school she got into in Germany was an 8-hour drive away from her home, from her parents and friends. And she decided she didn't want to move that far away from home. So she abandoned medicine and applied to pharmacy school instead, and is going to become a pharmacist. Now, in the US, it's really hard to understand how somebody who got into medical school would reject being a doctor to become a pharmacist. But in Germany, pharmacies are mostly independently run. It's not Rite Aid. Pharmacists can prescribe basic medicines. So if I have a fever or a sore throat or a tummy ache in Germany, I go to the pharmacist and she tells me, she gives me antibiotics or something else. Pharmacists get paid almost as much as doctors, who get paid relatively less. And so the difference between being a pharmacist and being a doctor is more a matter of taste than anything else. And so it's perfectly natural for someone to say, you know, I love my family, I love my friends, I don't want to move away. I'll do that. And notice the thing about this is it gave this young woman the freedom to run her life the way she wanted without fearing the status cliff that the American system imposes.
Totally. And I hope we can move towards that, closer to that approach. I mean, it certainly ties into the end of your book, where I thought, oh, I'm reading, and you're talking about, hey, you know, we need to kind of rethink how we do things, and we need to kind of restructure, you know, how the economy, you know, provides incentives, and how a better way could be good for everyone, not just the people left out, but also the elites. And I thought, oh, okay, so I'm about to hit the universal basic income chapter. And then the book ended.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's not where I thought he was going to go.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, you know, your prescription for solving this.
Well, so there are two parts of this. There's a shallow part and a deep part. The shallow part is I have a real political fear of universal basic income for the following reason. If there were a meaningful universal basic income in this country, the immediate political battle would become who gets it. And all of the forms of nativism, of, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment, of pro-white sentiment that are already in our politics would get turbocharged, because there'd be this question, you know, what if you're a DACA recipient? What if your parents are immigrants? Do you get universal basic income or not? What if you're black or brown? Is there a way to exclude you from universal basic income? Because as being a member would become more valuable, the pressure to keep people out. And so this would be really dangerous for our politics. And I continue to think that that's a real short-term problem, and that to solve universal basic income, one has to find a way to get a politics that's not divisive in its shadow. The deeper question is this. It took several hundred years in our culture to merge the idea of work and productivity with the idea of dignity and status. And to have the idea that I'm proud of being a hardworking and productive member of society, and that that's where my value comes from in my own eyes. And UBI is an effort to undo that, to break the connection between how much I produce and how much I'm entitled to. And that's an incredibly ambitious moral program. And I think when I wrote the book, I thought I don't know that we're up to it. And in the year or so since publishing the book, 2 years since finishing it, I have, for a series of other reasons, come to believe that, in fact, the future of humanity rests on breaking that connection. That an economy built around wages is an economy that is incompatible with the long-term success of our environment, and that we need to find a way to break the connection between production and consumption. And so UBI is really valuable for systemic ecological reasons, not just for political reasons. That's another discussion. But that's why I now am much more inclined to favor UBI than I was when I finished the book, and did not include that chapter as which would have been a natural chapter to include.
Yeah. Well, let me kind of run the Andrew Yang kind of argument past you around some of the concerns you raised. In terms of the political division that might ensue in with regards to who gets it, his approach was, well, every American citizen 18 and older would get it, black, white, brown, rich or poor. I think, interestingly enough, I agree with you that it would create new incentives for people to immigrate to the country, because it would be quite attractive. But I kind of feel like, well, actually, maybe that would be a bipartisan win, to the extent that we could say, hey, as to quote my favorite president, Obama, we're a nation of immigrants. We also need to be a nation of laws. And that if we do implement UBI for citizens, then it has to come with really comprehensive immigration reform and enforcement of those new immigration laws. And the fact that we are an attractive place for people with lesser means, like that has always been the case. And, it's not like it would be a new thing for us. It certainly would be exacerbated, and it would be more, more pronounced. But I feel like the benefit of having an economic floor, especially in a world where many of these kind of elite jobs are becoming sparser, and a lot of people are falling through the cracks, or even if you're in a good job, the industry and technology are changing so fast that you get disrupted. It's not like the guy that worked at McDonald's and worked his way up, or IBM and GE, and they were there for their whole life. Like, you're going to be changing jobs multiple times. So I kind of feel like the benefit of that stabilizing fact, and the fact that it's not a replacement for work. We don't have to convince people that work isn't important. They can still work, because the people who work hard and get lucky will definitely have a better lifestyle than the people who just have basic income. I feel like that's certainly better than today's prescriptions, which are forgive university debt, some middle-class tax cuts, and then a ton of welfare assistance just for the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, I mean, on the first point, let me see if you agree with this description of the problem. And I don't have a confident view about how to resolve it. One way to think about it is this: what is the main taproot of white nationalism and the politics of sort of ethno-national racist exclusion in this country? If you think the main taproot is the economic insecurity of the white working and middle class, then giving everyone universal basic income should reduce the intensity of the racism and the ethno-nationalism in our politics. If you think that the main taproot is not economic insecurity, but flat out cultural anxiety and racism, and the structure of this political movement is to find it intolerable that people who are not white, not European, particularly Black people, do well, then universal basic income will increase and exacerbate the virulence of white nationalism. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one it is. I don't know that I want to roll the dice on that one. I think that's a
yeah, there's I mean, there could be a little bit of both there. On the first one, you could take the position that people who are most angry and have the most anxiety already assume that trillions of dollars in their mind of government aid is going towards people that are not like them. And so if they started to see literally a universal basic income where everybody got the same check, then they might still be pissed that maybe people that don't look like them are getting it. But at least they feel like, well, at least now I'm getting something.
Yeah, it may be.
I mean, and the other thing is like, just to quote my favorite 2020 presidential candidate, Andrew Yang, he would say, there is a mindset of scarcity, and that if you're in Appalachia and you have no future and you see your coal mines getting shut down, you might be more likely to want to rally against something because you feel things are being taken from you. And it kind of like adds fuel to this fire that maybe a basic income could kind of moderate.
Yeah. Look, those effects are real. But I think the other effects are also real. And, status is a positional good, unlike material wealth. And there is in our society at the moment virulent bigotry associated with status anxiety in the white population. And that's also real. And so I don't know which is more powerful. If you're going to fail the story you're telling. Can you hear me still?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to lose your status and the world culturally is changing around you and you feel like changing too fast, I just don't see how getting a basic income check every month is going to make you more angry.
Well, so here, this is a couple of years ago, I did an experiment for a paper on altruism. And this part of the experiment ended up not getting in the published version. But in one of the experiments, we had people distribute real money between themselves and an anonymous other. And in one of the treatments, people could deprive other people of money in a way that would also deprive themselves of money, but would take less away from themselves than from other people. And a certain share of the population did not aim to maximize their own payout. They aimed to maximize the difference between their payout and the other guys. And they were willing to shoot themselves in the foot if doing so would shoot the other guy in both feet. And this was anonymized. This did not have race in it. This did not have ethno-nationalism in it. And so it is also part of human nature that you're willing to harm yourself if you harm somebody whom you despise more.
Yeah.
And I just don't know how. One thing we've seen in the Trump presidency is a substantial portion of voters supported a candidate who was damaging their economic interests.
Yeah.
Harm others.
I often have this debate with my brother, he's a Trump supporter, and he's always intrigued by saying, "Hey, Tom, you're doing well in life. Why are you voting for someone that's going to tax you more? And you're not going to benefit from it. Trump has been so good for you, for your family." And then I say, well, why are you going to these MAGA rallies in states where they are chanting in favor of policies that are clearly going to harm their community, certainly more than me in the Bay Area? We're fine, Right. And it is frustrating to see how this is happening, but I agree with you. Like, you could do the math and say, wow, basic income should benefit everyone. And I guess your point is, if people feel like blocking it will hurt the groups they don't like, they might actually do that, even if it benefits them, right, and moves them forward, which I suppose we'll have to figure out how to overcome.
I don't know what the answer is. I mean, part of it is, you know, the great talent of political leadership, you know, on the grand scale, is to be able to persuade people not to think in that way. To be able to persuade people to think in a way that I want to help others as I help myself, and to right kind of community sentiment and the right kind of patriotism. And partly, I think, you know, we'll never know whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, because in a sense, if it gets enacted, they will have made it a good idea because they have the talent to make it so, right?
Yeah.
You know, you've made yourself by winning.
Hopefully we do get a leader in the near future that can finally cause the country to agree on things that help everyone. But I certainly admit that we are not set up. We're not on a trajectory to do that today, and it will require a leader and a movement, and probably a lot of time to kind of get us there. But you know what? I remember growing up in the 80s where people would call other people tree huggers and be sort of very dismissive of supporting the environment. And I think that has come a long way. So, you know, man can evolve in their thinking, and hopefully we'll get you back on, Professor Markovits, in the future to continue this conversation. I know I promised you it would be closer to 30 minutes, but really enjoyed hearing your thoughts and kind of exchanging ideas about where we can go in the future.
It's been a real pleasure listening to you, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Right on. And hopefully, if anybody in the Yang Speaks team, or if Andrew, if you get a clip of this interview, consider having Daniel on the Yang Speaks podcast. I think Andrew and you, Daniel, would have a real fun time exchanging ideas, because I think you guys are arriving at similar conclusions through different approaches, and that'd be really nice to see a marrying of the two perspectives.
I would love to meet him.
All right. With that, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.
Ha ha.